In the plains of Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming, 400 nuclear missiles sit in hardened concrete silos drilled into the earth. Each one is ready to launch within minutes of a presidential order. Each one carries a warhead that can flatten a city. Each one has been sitting in that silo on continuous alert for over 50 years. The Minuteman III entered service in 1970. It was designed for a 10-year service life. The Air Force referred to the life-extended versions after a $7 billion refurbishment program as basically new missiles except for the shell. A September 2025 report from the Government Accountability Office concluded it is feasible to keep them running until 2050. That would be 80 years of continuous alert. A missile designed in the 1960s, expected to last a decade, standing watch into the middle of the 21st century. The Air Force has been trying to replace the Minuteman III since the 1980s. The Peacekeeper ICBM was supposed to replace it. Congress retired the Peacekeeper in 2005. The Sentinel, the current replacement program run by Northrop Grumman, was supposed to cost $78 billion and reach initial operational capability in 2029. As of 2024, the program had triggered a Nunn-McCurdy breach, the legal threshold for catastrophic cost overruns, with costs now projected at $140 billion and initial operational capability delayed into the 2030s. The Air Force then discovered that the existing Minuteman III silos, some dating to the 1960s, are full of asbestos and lead paint and cannot be reused. It will have to dig 400 brand new silos. And when you understand the one strategic argument that has kept the Minuteman III alive through every program that was supposed to end it, an argument that its own critics call by a name that sounds like defeat, you will understand why a missile nobody expected to still exist is the most important weapon the United States has never fired. To understand the Minuteman III, you have to understand what nuclear deterrence looked like before it existed. The first American ICBMs, the Atlas and the Titan, ran on liquid propellant. Liquid fuel delivered the thrust needed to hurl a warhead across the planet. It also created a problem that no amount of engineering could fully solve. You could not store a liquid-fueled missile fueled and ready. The propellants were corrosive, cryogenic, or both. They ate the tanks that held them. They required loading before launch, and loading took time, sometimes hours. In a world where a Soviet first strike would give warning measured in minutes, a missile that needed hours of preparation before launch was not a deterrent. It was a target. Colonel Edward Hall, working within General Bernard Schriever's Western Development Division in 1956, convinced the Air Force that solid fuel propellant could power a true ICBM. Solid fuel, a rubbery mixture of ammonium perchlorate and a binding agent, cast around a star-shaped hollow core, would burn when ignited, but could sit inert for years. A solid fuel ICBM could be stored, fueled and ready, in a hardened silo indefinitely. No loading, no waiting. Minutes from the order to the launch. Boeing built it. The first Minuteman was launched February 1, 1961, from Cape Canaveral. It performed flawlessly. 3 stages, clean burns, the warhead on target 4,600 miles away, 25 minutes after liftoff. By 1967, 1,000 Minuteman silos had been completed across the American plains. The Minuteman III, the MIRV-capable variant that could carry 3 independently targeted warheads, entered service in 1970. What the Air Force had built was a missile that could go from a cold alert to launch in about a minute. Not hours, not 30 minutes, 60 seconds. And it would sit in that readiness posture indefinitely without degrading. That capability, instant readiness, sustained for decades, was the founding design achievement. Everything that has kept the Minuteman III alive flows from that original insight. The Minuteman III, which entered service in 1970, added something the earlier variants lacked: MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. A single missile could carry up to 3 warheads, each steerable to a separate target during the post-boost phase. For strategic planners, this meant a force of 550 Minuteman IIIs could threaten more than 1,000 Soviet targets. For arms control negotiators, it meant the calculus of parity had just become significantly more complicated. By the time the last Minuteman silo was completed in 1967, and the 3 variant was being deployed 3 years later, the United States had built the most cost-effective nuclear deterrent in history. Not because the individual missile was cheap, though it was, but because the combination of solid fuel, hardened basing, and rapid launch created a force that no adversary could ignore, and no first strike could cleanly eliminate. By the early 1970s, the Soviet Union had achieved rough nuclear parity with the United States, and the strategic planners at Strategic Air Command worked through the arithmetic of what that parity meant. The conclusion they reached was uncomfortable. Soviet ICBMs, improving in accuracy and yield, were approaching the point where a first strike could destroy a significant fraction of the American ICBM force in its silos before it could launch. In a theoretical disarming strike, the Soviets would not need to destroy all 1,000 Minuteman silos. They would need to destroy enough of them, paired with strikes on command and control sites, to cripple the ability to order a coherent response. The submarine force and the bomber force existed as backup, but ICBMs on a moment's alert were the visible, immediate answer. Then the planners turned the problem around. If destroying the American ICBM force was the Soviet goal, what did that require? The answer was straightforward. To destroy a hardened missile silo with reasonable confidence, you needed to dedicate multiple nuclear warheads to it. To destroy 450 American silos, the Soviets would have to expend a large fraction of their entire strategic arsenal, hundreds of warheads, on targets that were, in the end, uninhabited holes in the ground in Montana and Wyoming. Every warhead used on a Minuteman silo was a warhead not used on an American city. Every warhead absorbed by a hardened concrete tube in the plains was a warhead that did not reach New York, or Chicago, or Los Angeles. The Minuteman force, dispersed across thousands of square miles in 5 states, was not primarily a weapon. It was a sponge. This is the argument that defense strategists have called the nuclear sponge, and that its critics call by the same name with contempt. If a nuclear war ever came, these missiles would do their job not primarily by surviving and striking back, but by absorbing the first blow. By forcing an adversary to exhaust a devastating portion of its arsenal, destroying empty silos rather than populated cities, the Minuteman force would limit the catastrophe, at the cost of turning the American planes into a nuclear target. This argument is simultaneously the strongest case for the Minuteman III and the most disturbing thing ever said in its defense. It is also the real reason the missile is still in the ground. The nuclear sponge argument is strategically sound and morally troubling in equal measure, which is why the Air Force has spent 40 years trying to find something that makes the case for ICBMs on terms that don't require saying out loud that the point is to get hit first. The Peacekeeper, the LGM-118A, was supposed to replace the Minuteman III beginning in the mid-1980s. More accurate, larger payload, 10 warheads per missile. It was fielded in 1986, deployed in Minuteman III silos at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. Congress retired it in 2005, leaving the Minuteman III as the sole American land-based ICBM. The Sentinel, formerly the ground-based strategic deterrent, now the LGM-35A, was supposed to be the clean, modern replacement. Northrop Grumman won the sole source contract in 2020 after Boeing withdrew from the competition, citing an unfair advantage from Northrop's acquisition of a key propulsion supplier. Initial cost estimate, $78 billion. Fielding target, 2029. What actually happened is one of the more striking procurement failures in recent American military history. By January 2024, The program triggered a critical Nunn-McCurdy breach. Costs had grown more than 30% above baseline, the threshold for mandatory congressional review. The Pentagon's analysis found an unrealistic delivery schedule, ineffective systems engineering, and what it called an atrophied industrial base for ICBM production. The restructured program carries costs now estimated at $140 billion, 81% above the original estimate, with initial operational capability pushed to the early 2030s at best. Then, in 2025, came the detail that changed the timeline entirely. A test conversion at Vandenberg Space Force Base confirmed that the existing Minuteman III silos, some dating to the early 1960s, filled with asbestos, lead paint, and design constraints incompatible with Sentinel's digital architecture, cannot be reused. The Air Force will have to excavate and construct approximately 400 entirely new silos, a construction project the Air Force itself compared in scale to the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. In September 2025, the GAO concluded that operating the Minuteman III until 2050 is feasible. An Air Force official stated that Minuteman III and Sentinel operations would overlap for at least 15 years. Some of those missiles would be 80 years old. The Minuteman III is still in the ground because the sponge argument has never been answered, only avoided. Every defense of the Minuteman III's continued existence, stripped of technical language, comes back to the same proposition. If an adversary wants to conduct a disarming nuclear first strike, they must expend warheads on the American plains. Destroying 450 dispersed silos across 5 states, each hardened to withstand overpressure that would destroy almost anything else, requires an adversary to commit a significant fraction of its strategic arsenal to targets that cannot strike back, cannot move, and contain only missiles that would otherwise destroy their cities. The mathematics of this are not disputed. An attack on the ICBM force uses up the attacker's warheads. Warheads used on silos are warheads not used on population centers. The attack still happens, but it is constrained. The part that nobody says in the briefing rooms, at least not plainly, the sponge works by being a target. The people who live in the plains of Montana and Wyoming and North Dakota are not inside the silos. They live near them. A nuclear exchange aimed at disarming the American ICBM force would not spare the surrounding towns and cities from fallout, blast pressure, and secondary effects. The logic of the sponge accepts this. It trades the concentration of catastrophe in population centers for dispersal across a zone that is already the target zone. The Air Force does not say this in its public arguments for the Sentinel program, which run instead to accuracy improvements, deterrent stability, and the need to face 2 nuclear peer adversaries simultaneously. These are genuine arguments, but underneath them is the sponge. 450 holes in the ground, each requiring 2 or more warheads to destroy with confidence, collectively holding at risk a large fraction of any adversary's entire strategic nuclear capacity. The Sentinel is supposed to replace the sponge with a better sponge, more accurate, more survivable, hardened against modern threats. The program is $60 billion over budget, years behind schedule, and now digging brand new holes in the American plains because the old holes are full of asbestos. Meanwhile, U.S. force structure has centered on 400 deployed land-based ICBMs on continuous alert, and that requirement doesn't care that the replacement is running late. The Minuteman III stays because the sponge has to stay. There is a counter-argument that serious strategists make, and it deserves to be named. ICBMs on high alert, ready to launch within minutes, create a hair-trigger problem. A president facing a warning of inbound Soviet missiles, a warning that might be a false alarm, as has happened multiple times in both American and Soviet history, has less than 10 minutes to decide whether to launch before the silos are destroyed. That is not a comfortable margin for the most consequential decision in human history. The submarine-launched ballistic missiles on Trident boats cannot be detected and destroyed by a first strike. They provide a guaranteed second strike capability without demanding a launch-on-warning posture. Critics of the ICBM force argue that the sponge's strategic value does not justify its instability risk, and that retiring the land-based leg would make nuclear war less likely without meaningfully reducing deterrent strength. These are not fringe arguments. Former Defense Secretary William Perry, who oversaw the nuclear arsenal, has made them publicly and repeatedly. There is a version of the Minuteman III story that sounds like ordinary procurement dysfunction. Old weapon, failed replacement program, bureaucratic inertia. That version is wrong. The Minuteman III is still in the ground because the strategic argument for it is genuinely difficult to refute and genuinely difficult to defend. Its critics are not wrong to call it the nuclear sponge. Its defenders are not wrong to say the sponge prevents cities from burning. Both things are true at the same time. This is what nuclear deterrence looks like when you strip the doctrine down to what it actually means. 400 missiles sit in the planes tonight. They were designed to last 10 years. They have been on continuous alert for over 50 years. The GAO says they can run until 2050. No other weapon in American service has been asked to do this, to serve as the guarantor of civilization survival by being, at least in part, civilization's designated sacrifice zone. The Sentinel will eventually replace them. The silos are being dug. The program continues despite everything. But it will not be ready when the Air Force said it would, and the Minuteman III will stay until it is. Because a sponge that isn't there doesn't absorb anything. If that's the kind of history you're here for, the weapons that reveal the logic underneath the strategy, and the price the logic demands, subscribe. More is coming.